Okay, everyone, welcome. My name is Karin Vagland. I'm a postdoc with the NCCR. On behalf of the organizing committee, I'm honored to present this year's keynote speaker, Professor James Hollifield. Hollifield is a professor of international political economy in the Department of Political Science at Southern Methodist University in Texas, where he also serves as the director of the Tower Center. Holyfield's extensive scholarly contributions have profoundly influenced the field of migration studies. He is known for conceptualizing key ideas such as the migration state and the liberal paradox. And in addition to his academic achievements, Professor Hollifield has lent his expertise as an advisor to various governments and international organizations. In his lecture today, he will provide us with valuable context and insights into the historic, political, and economic backdrop for Trump's migration policies. So this is a very, very timely lecture. We are also privileged to have with us Professor Sandra Lavanney, a distinguished migration scholar and political scientist from the University of Geneva, and she is also a project leader with the NCCR. So Lavanney is a leading expert on European migration policy and has made substantial contributions to the literature on EU migration governance specifically. And following Holyfield's lecture, she will offer a comparative, perhaps European perspective on recent developments in the US. And after both presentations, we will open the floor for a Q&A session, thus providing you with the opportunity to engage with our esteemed speakers. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Hollifield.
OK. Pour moi, c'est un grand plaisir d'être retour ici en Suisse, Neuchâtel. J'ai vécu en Suisse quand j'avais 19-20 ans. J'ai toujours gardé des souvenirs, de très bons souvenirs de la Suisse. Et c'est toujours un plaisir de revenir ici. So I will, having said a few things in French, I apologize I can't say something similarly in German, but that would be bad for you and me too. But I have to just say a few things before I start the lecture. First of all, my great friend and colleague, Johnny D'Amato. All of us in this room know Johnny and what he's done. But with this program, the NCCR on the Move is an internationally renowned program, and it has done so much to bring people like all of you in this room together, so many scholars, especially. I've been on the board of the NCCR, I think, since the inception through various phases. And always a great pleasure to see so many young scholars coming together with a few old senior folks like me. And I also have to really extend a thanks to the staff of the NCCR, especially the fabulous Gina Fiore. How many times Gina has bailed me out of, bad train tickets, wrong timing. But I've been on a bit of a whirlwind tour here. I spent a few weeks in Japan, early June, then in Scandinavia, back in Paris for a couple of glorious weeks, although we were there for Emisco last week. And Johnny, it was hot in Paris. It was hotter in Paris, much hotter than it was in Texas, so that doesn't happen very often. But on this tour, I have been doing my best to try to explain what in the heck is going on in the United States of America. Big changes in our politics, both domestic politics and our foreign policy. So here I am in Neuchâtel. Also, I'm going to try to enlighten you on some of the things that are happening. I will be going back to Texas at the end of the week. I'm just hoping we'll be able to get back in the country after all the things I've had to say about Trump, but we'll see. Okay, so this is a lecture about the dilemmas of immigration control, and specifically zeroing in on this idea of the liberal paradox. I know a lot of you in this room probably have heard of this idea. I think I first advanced this idea maybe in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So it's been around for a while. And I did pose a question. Has Trump resolved the liberal paradox? That's the question. And first of all, just a little shameless publicity. Some of what I have to say is covered in this book. Again, many of you in the room probably know this book, which is now in its 4th edition. There is a brilliant chapter in the book on Switzerland, written by some guy named D'Amato. So check it out. Check out the book. I know I won't get through this entire thing, but I'm going to do my best to, I guess I better stay in front of the camera here. I'm walking around too much. Hopefully those of you who are online will be able to see and hear me. But I will go through this fairly quickly, and we're going to leave hopefully a lot of time for questions and for my colleague Sandra Lavenet's comments. I think I've known Sandra also for a very long time, maybe even since she was a graduate student in Florence. I think we go back that far. So I'm looking forward to her comments. But so I want to talk about the dilemmas of immigration control. And at least a few of you in the room were in Emisco. I don't know if Anna is here somewhere, but we got into issue of narratives. So much of what happens in immigration policy revolves around the narratives, the myths surrounding immigration control, a lot of symbolic politics. I know some of you in the room are political scientists and will know what that means. Then I will talk quickly about the economic dilemma, the demographic dilemma, and if I have time, I want to say something about immigration and the open society. You will know that that expression comes from the great Austrian-American philosopher Karl Popper in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. So, dilemmas. The liberal paradox. I have advanced this idea that in order for liberal societies to prosper, they need to be open economically. And that means being open to trade, investment, and migration. Richard Rosecrans, you see his name in parentheses here, wrote a book way back in the 1980s about the trading state. And I, since at least 25 years or so, I've been writing about what I call the migration state, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. But the problem with liberal societies is they must maintain some degree of closure politically and legally, because liberal democracies depend on the demos, citizenship, the institutions of citizenship and nationality. For those of you who've ever read Spheres of Justice by the political philosopher Michael Walzer, you will know what I'm referring to. So this is a paradox, if you think about it for a moment. It's a paradox. How can societies be both open and closed at the same time? If you want to see a picture of the migration state, you might just write this down. We can come back to it in the discussion. But I have argued for many years that migration policy is basically a four-dimensional game. There are four dimensions to the trade-offs that are involved. And I want to get into some of these trade-offs during the talk here. But I will just say very quickly, and all states, no matter where they are, have to face these dilemmas and these trade-offs, not just liberal democracies, but also autocracies. But in normal times, we have lots of debates about markets, the economic dilemmas associated with migration. And of course, something I have written about since the beginning of my career, we have to talk about the status and the rights of the immigrants. But there are times, as we know in history, when security issues will overwhelm the issues of markets and rights. And when you look at the perfect storm, culture comes into play. And I know culture is a very big, amorphous term. I'll try to illustrate what I mean by that as I go through this. So if you just imagine if you're a politician leading a government, how do you find an equilibrium in this game? It's very, very hard. How do you make those trade-offs? And we see this constantly. Now, already, this is a very difficult game. It's a four-dimensional game, but it's also a game that has to be played on three different levels. So I don't know if there are any chess players in here, but imagine all the trade-offs you have to make, but you have to think of this at least in three dimensions. I mean, three levels. Obviously, immigration is a big issue at the local level. A lot of you in here study cities, towns. Obviously, it is an issue that's debated at the national level intensely in every society. Each society is different. I'm going to talk a lot about the U.S. in this lecture. And of course, anything that happens at the national level with respect to migration is going to affect the region. It's going to have international repercussions and foreign policy repercussions. So it's a four-dimensional game that is played on three different levels. I'm just going to show you some pictures to try to drive home the points that I'm making here. I think when you think about markets, think about the demand for labor. This is a poster group of young Italian men who've arrived in the Munich train station. They look very happy to me. They're going to work. This is 1960. And of course, I'm sure you can read the German. If you just have 60 marks, you can buy yourself an Italian. So just think about that. And when we think about why so many foreigners came to work in Europe after the Second World War, the receiving states went and recruited people to come and work. Same thing happened in the United States with the Bracero program. A lot of guest worker programs. That's how these migrations really got started. Since we're in Switzerland, I thought I would at least mention this famous quote from the Swiss author, playwright, Max Frisch. I think I'm not going to butcher the German here. We can come back and get you to read the German, but we asked for workers, but human beings, people came instead. For those of you who are not Swiss, maybe you've not heard this before. But we see a big humanitarian turn with respect to migration, starting already in the 60s and 70s. This is just a picture of workers in the fields in California. Shouldn't these people have citizenship? Shouldn't they be given rights? And of course, the big dilemma in the United States. We have 10, 12 million people who are living and working in the United States without status, unauthorized. So that is a huge problem in the U.S. debates. Just again, thinking about the mythology and the symbolism. This is a famous selfie with the German chancellor here, who famously said in 2015, 16, wir schaffen das. We can manage this. We can do this. I think she said, we solved the Euro crisis. We can resolve this refugee crisis. And she said that Germany would have a new Willkommenskultur. This is just a picture of me standing in front of a billboard. I think this is in Bochum, in the Ruhrgebiet. And again, you can see the German sentiments here. The greatest disaster is forgetting. But if you're going to be open to migration, open to people who are fleeing, as happened in 2015, 16, politicians have to be constantly aware of the danger of moral hazard, that if you open the doors too widely, maybe too many people will come, too many will risk making the journey. This is a picture of New York, 9/11, 2001, with the attack on the World Trade Center. Again, culture, I always like this picture here, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Don't I have a right to be different, to wear what I choose to wear, reflecting my identity, my culture. Again, pictures driving home the cultural dimension of these debates. Okay, all of you recognize Jean-Marie Le Pen. You recognize, everybody know who this guy is? I often refer to him as Monsieur Farage, Nigel Farage, Monsieur Farage. He's a descendant of French Huguenot refugees who crossed the Channel on small boats many centuries ago, so somewhat of an irony there. And of course, I think you all recognize this guy here, who has made his political career running against immigrants, against immigration, and it brought him to the White House once, and it has brought him back to power a second time. So very quickly, I'm going to go through this very fast. Just want to show you a few things. I think most of you are familiar with the numbers here, but we have reached a historic high again in proportional terms. We're at about 50 million foreign-born people in the United States in terms of the migrant stock, and that is very close to where it was around the turn of the 19th and the 20th century. So again, you can just see where we are in terms of overall immigration. But I want to focus a little bit more on the narrative, and again, going very fast. I'm sorry to go so fast, but if any of you, when we come back to the discussion, we can get into this. But the U.S. is often referred to as a nation of immigrants. You take a minute to look at this quote here. I can read it for you. The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges. Interesting quote. Any idea who said that? Probably not. That's the first president of the United States. So this idea of the United States as a land of refuge, a nation of immigrants, this goes back to the founding. Of course, we know that George Washington and the founding fathers, they owned slaves. Washington had 200 or 300 slaves. So the U.S. itself was founded upon this massive contradiction. Again, I probably don't even need to read this, but where is this immigration sonnet poem? It is inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty in Washington, D.C. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Another quote for you, just to get you thinking about the narrative, looking back in American history. Apologies to my Italian friends in the room, but Italians are murderers and bootleggers. Go back to where you belong. You do not appreciate this country. Who said this? You might be shocked to find out. President Herbert Hoover. He said that in a letter that he wrote to some guy named Fiorello LaGuardia, who was a congressman, a Republican congressman from New York. The mayor of New York, and I think he has an airport named after him. It's actually been upgraded. It's a very nice airport now. I think Joe Biden once referred to it as a third world airport, but it's actually quite a nice airport now if you get a chance. But just think about these kinds of debates. And if you look back in American history, lots and lots of episodes of nativism. So I'm going to try to stress with you that Trump is taking us back to the future. We have seen this many times before in American history. In the late 18th century, lots of anti-German and anti-French feelings. Mid-century, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, the Know Nothing Party, you probably have heard of them. 1870s, 80s, very much an anti-Chinese, anti-Asian. It's 1882, you have the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was extended to include all Asians, especially the Japanese as well. Fast forward the period of the Russian Revolution, a lot of anti-East European, the Red Scare, the fear of communism, Bolshevism, and of course that became also very anti-Semitic because it was a period when you have lots of Jewish migration to the U.S. 20s, anti-Italian, anti-Polish, anti-Mexican. 40s, anti-Japanese, anti-Mexican. And more recently, a lot of Islamophobia, anti-refugee. So there's nothing especially new about this. Trump is taking us back to a virulent form of nativism, nationalism. Again, just a picture for you to, this is a propaganda poster from the 1920s. You can see Uncle Sam climbing up the mountain, denouncing immigration, the dangers of all of these people coming from around the world. A couple of more things about the narrative. Most of you probably know who Ben Franklin is, one of the founding fathers, who lived he was born and grew up in Boston, but lived most of his life in Pennsylvania. And love this quote: "Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of German aliens who will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion?" You know, the Germans are very dark-skinned, swarthy, dangerous people. Fast forward to the 2000s, you can see my colleague, I spent about 10 years at Harvard, the late Samuel Huntington, who also in one of his last books denounced immigration and Mexicans as being a threat to American identity. Huntington, in his book, said there were only 3 waves of immigration in American history. The first wave, he thought the first wave was in the 19th century, the second wave coming at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and of course the third wave coming starting in the 1970s and 80s. He did not count the first wave of immigration from the British Isles because he said that was the period of the founding of the country, and that the U.S. is fundamentally a Puritan, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. California is a place which always had a lot of nativism. Ironically, today, California is one of the most progressive, open states in the country. But if you look back historically, there were very strong bouts of nativism starting in California. I don't really have time to get into this, but I'm happy to come back and discuss it. If you look back historically, I think we can see basically 4 different sort of ideal types of the way Americans thought about migration, going back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which John Winthrop, who was the governor of the colony, called it a shining city on the hill. These were the Puritans, basically saying, you can come and live here, but you have to be like us, look like us, you have to worship the way we do. So there's not much tolerance. In the Virginia model, the planters, they just want your labor. And of course, they impress the native peoples, many of whom died from diseases. Then they began to import African slaves, so only interested in labor and guest workers. Then the Pennsylvania model, the Quakers, who were much more open, and tolerant. You can come live here, work, practice whatever religion you want, as long as you accept the basic ideals of Republican government. California, as I mentioned, is a place which has a lot more nativism. Now, again, quickly some numbers. We have seen, and of course, these are a little bit out of date, the combination of Trump and the pandemic really cut legal immigration in half. The flows of legal immigrants into the U.S. have been averaging since the 1990s about 1 million a year. Those dropped to 500,000. Of course, Trump is taking them way down again. And refugees and asylum seeking also going down. Refugee quotas drastically curtailed. Today, Trump is basically stopping all refugees, stopping all asylum seeking in the U.S. He's revoking the temporary status for hundreds of thousands, millions of people. Net immigration to the United States did recover in the Biden years. After the pandemic, it came back up to more normal levels, as you can see here. But again, if I projected this out to 2024, 25, you would see a very, very precipitous fall in net immigration. And here you can see how recent arrivals have boosted the foreign-born population in the United States. Again, recovering to something like more normal flows. Unauthorized immigrant population has been trending down. It reached its highest level around 2007, right before the pandemic. I'm sorry, right before the Great Recession. It has been trending down. It bumped up again somewhat after the pandemic, but lots of people have been going home. We've seen big return migration to Mexico and even some to Central America. I think all of you know about the surge in apprehensions at the southwestern border. Again, I don't have time to go into all of these, but we did see a big spike, which actually started during the first Trump administration and then soared after the pandemic. This just shows you what was going on in terms of this migration, unauthorized migration in particular, thinking about monthly encounters at the southwestern border. And again, you can see how these started trending up following the pandemic. Again, more on the numbers. The unauthorized population in the U.S., this is a pretty striking number. The unauthorized population in the U.S. is almost 1/4 of the migrant population. So it is pretty high by any standards. I'm going to switch now from looking at numbers and the flows and stocks. I want to talk about specifically about the economic dilemmas that are associated with migration. And let me just pause here and say, when you think about whether Trump has resolved the liberal paradox, we are still facing in the United States the same economic and demographic realities which most countries in the OECD world are facing. So I don't think we're going to be able to escape from this dilemma. And let me see if I can illustrate that. One of the big problems for the United States is, and this is true going back to the 1965 law, we admit people primarily on the basis of family connections and kinship. Only about 1/4 of those who are admitted for employment purposes, obviously refugees and asylees. This diversity category, that's the famous diversity visa, where a lottery is held for nationalities that are underrepresented in the other categories. So, for example, if you were wanting to immigrate to the U.S. and you were Japanese, which very few Japanese are immigrating to the U.S., or Norwegian, you could apply for one of these diversity visas. And here you can see how the United States, is an outlier in terms of the small number of permanent work-based immigrants. We're not much ahead of Korea. Switzerland, you can see, admits a lot of people for work, as does Spain. Italy, Germany, Australia. The U.S. is very much an outlier. Canada, on the other hand, as you know, Canada admits many more people to come and work. So this is just a contrast of the way in which these different countries confront the economic dilemma of such high demand for foreign and immigrant labor. This picture's a little blurry, and I apologize for it. Maybe we can turn that off. There we go. Okay. So Yeah, that's okay. Got it. This picture is showing you how employment in the U.S. is growing. It's surging in the 21st century. Immigration is trending along behind that. So employment is far outstripping immigration. So you can see how tight the labor market is, how much we need foreign workers, foreign labor. And of course, if you look at U.S. policy, the problem is it's very focused on family, not work. There's no alternative for people who want to come and work in the U.S. If you were a Mexican or an Indian and you applied to get a work visa to come to the United States through the normal channels, you might have to wait 20 or 30 years to be admitted. So this obviously creates a very large black market for labor. The work-based visa quotas, I'll show you some other numbers, are very much insufficient. Skilled workers face long queues. Country quotas penalize the populous nations, the countries like India that would send far more people to the United States. They are penalized through this quota system. And if you look at the allocation of visas in the United States, it makes no sense whatsoever. It's a sort of first come, first served basis, almost like a lottery. So the U.S. immigration system is fundamentally broken in this sense. This is an interesting chart, which I constructed with a colleague at the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank. And it just shows you that there's a pretty close correlation between high levels of employment growth in these different states and the growth in the foreign-born population. So those who are coming in, they're gravitating to the states and the areas where there is tremendous demand, where the economy is growing and expanding. So again, the immigrants are not stealing jobs from natives. They are not substitutes for native workers. They are complements in the workforce. Again, I don't have time to get into all of the econometric evidence on this, but here you can see how much the correlation is between immigrant, foreign-born population growth and the growth of economies in these states. Immigrants add tremendously to the high-skilled labor force. You can see the red number of foreign-born. They compensate very much for the low-skilled. So again, this just shows you the economic imperatives, the economic dilemmas. Here you can see that immigrant workers are very much overrepresented at the extremes of the educational distribution. They are very important at the lowest end of the labor market. There are basically very, very few Americans who, without a high school degree, without much education, who are willing to fill these jobs at the low end of the labor market. So the foreign-born share is very, very high. The same is true at the high end of the labor market. Those pursuing a doctoral degree, almost a third of them are foreign-born. Again, I think I'll skip over some of these, but just quickly mentioning the fact that the H-2B visas for low-skilled people, there's a tremendous demand for these visas. Trump has talked about perhaps increasing the number of visas. I haven't seen any move in that direction yet, but that would be a logical thing to do. STEM, healthcare, you can look at these categories here. I recently had to go visit a very ill friend in a hospital in Paris, and if you look at the people who are working in the hospitals, I mean, most of you probably have had this experience, the physicians, the doctors, the nurses, the technicians are very much, it's very much an immigrant and foreign labor force. So this just shows you how important the foreign workers are in each of these sectors. I think I'll skip that one. Foreign students have been much in the news of late. The foreign students are driving the rise in PhDs awarded. since 2000. So Trump has said he wants to stop foreign students from coming, studying in the United States. This will be, as you can imagine, devastating, of course, for students who have planned their careers to come and study in the U.S., and it will be devastating for many universities in the U.S. that admit large numbers of foreign students. Okay, very quickly, the demographic dilemmas, the demographic imperative. I think all of you know that we're living in rapidly aging societies. We need labor, we need people. Some of my work has had an impact, believe it or not. It's unusual to see our work debated in national parliaments, but I was just in Japan for a couple of weeks, and my work has started to really catch on in the debates in Japan. Japan, of course, like Korea, Taiwan, these are societies that are facing, basically economic collapse. So the Japanese are debating now. They're beginning to open up and develop an immigration policy. I'd be happy to talk more about Japan. But just to show you the demographic imperative, if you look at net immigration, it is now the thing that's adding more than the natural increase, and I think this will become the new normal, that immigration is the only thing that will be feeding population growth in our societies. Here, again, is a graph that shows you, just look at this, thinking about immigration and the working age population in the U.S., you can see how important the U.S. born with immigrant parents, the second generation, the first generations, this is projecting out. And basically nearly half of labor force growth since 1995 has been due to immigration. All labor force growth, all the growth in the labor force in the next 2 decades in the U.S. will be from immigrants and their children. Let me repeat that, So this is a very, very strong imperative. This is from the Congressional Budget Office, projecting out net immigration. You can see in the blue here, the native population growth. So again, you can see that if our societies are going to continue to be dynamic and to grow, migration will play an incredibly important role in this. This is just a quick chart to show you, since we're talking about demography here. Often you hear the argument that immigrants are coming, they're taking the jobs, they're getting on the dole, public welfare. That this chart shows you, if you look at the fiscal impact of immigration, it's like immigrants, their children, second generation, the natives, it's very, very similar in terms of what their fiscal impact is. They use public services when they're young and when they're old. So it's very, very similar to the natives. Again, this is an interesting chart here, which shows you population growth in France and the USA, and it looks quite similar. Both societies had a baby boom. Again, we could go in and look at these numbers. But they have become increasingly dependent on immigration, which is the gray area at the top, to feed population growth. Contrast this with Germany and Spain, where you see much earlier demographic transition, a sort of collapse. Spain, very dramatic there. It's immigration that's really sustaining population growth. Germany, something very similar. So again, just looking at these demographic charts tells you something. So I'm going to take a few minutes. How are we doing on time? 10 more minutes? Oh, good. Okay. All right. Now, I'm glad that Matteo is here, because I want to talk about Karl Popper a little bit. And I want to talk about what I call immigration control, liberal democracy, and the open society. So just bear with me. This is a little bit of an aside, looking at why immigration control? Why is immigration such a key issue in our democracies today, and how the debate has been twisted, and how it is undermining our democracy and our open society. Again, I think all of you, if you think about liberalism, liberal democracy, immigration Again, going back to the liberal paradox, it reveals many contradictions. This is the famous Enlightenment idea of natural rights, eloquently outlined by Thomas Jefferson, again, one of the founding fathers, a slave holder. Again, I don't need to read this to you, but all men are created equal, et cetera, et cetera. That's the Enlightenment idea. Obviously, this statement makes no mention of race, but we know the framers of the American Constitution, including Jefferson, would codify race, protect slavery in the U.S. Constitution, to placate the interests of the slaveholding Southern planters. Hence, the American social contract itself was built upon the idea of racial superiority, and it argues for a degree of political and legal closure based explicitly on race. So we, the people, at the end of the 18th century, did not include the peoples of other races, the indigenous people, or women, for that matter. But the other side of liberalism, of course, is the economic side of liberalism, which we find in Adam Smith. His book, Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776, exactly at the same time as the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence. Smith optimistically said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest." And of course, he used the metaphor of the invisible hand to argue for laissez-faire. If left alone, individuals pursuing their own self-interest will promote the welfare of society as a whole. So you can see here the political side of liberalism, the economic side of liberalism. But neither the framers of the U.S. Constitution nor Adam Smith had very much to say about immigration, but it is precisely the movement of individuals as labor across boundaries that pose the biggest dilemma for liberals, and it is the working out of these dilemmas and contradictions through a process of political struggle at the domestic and international level that drives much of political development in liberal democracies. And I would argue economic and human development in the world as a whole depends very much on migration, the movement of people, the mobility of people. So you begin to see why immigration is a big issue for liberals. This might come as a little bit of a shock or a surprise, but I'm going to get to Karl Popper in just a moment. But this is a quote from Mein Kampf, which reflected the zeitgeist of the 1920s. And this is what Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf: "The instinct for the preservation of one's own species is the primary cause that leads to the formation of human communities." So the state, according to Hitler, is fundamentally a racial organization. It is not an economic organization. Hitler saw liberalism, economics, as a danger that would undermine the racial basis of society and the state. This is another quote from Mein Kampf. Sorry, I don't have the German up there, but in North America, Hitler wrote, "The Teutonic element, which has kept its racial stock pure and did not mix it with any other racial stock, has come to dominate the American continent and will remain master of it as long as that element does not fall a victim to the habit of adulterating its blood." Does that remind you of any quotes from politicians of late? This is exactly what Donald Trump said several times, that immigration leads to the poisoning of the blood, the adulteration of the blood. Hitler would go on to contrast the peoples of North America and the peoples of South America. He said the North Americans are going to be dominant because they're Teutonic, they're Aryan. The South Americans will decline because too much mixing of the races. So again, Hitler feared that economic thinking and economic forces would lead to more individualism. This would undermine his vision of a racial society. Popper, Karl Popper, Austrian Jewish philosopher who had to flee Austria, fled to the United States. When he wrote his book, The Open Society and His Enemies, he was trying to explain responding to the scourge of Nazism. And for those, I don't know how many of you in the room have read Popper. Sometimes it's assigned in graduate seminars. I had to read it when I was a student. And Popper argued that it is critical rationalism. You might want to think about that. Constantly probing and testing one's assumption. And this, of course, for the graduate students, formulating arguments that are falsifiable. It doesn't do any good to advance arguments that can't really be tested against the evidence. But this is what Popper said is the best defense against racism, tyranny, and oppression. Of course, he was trying to explain and understand what had happened in Germany with the rise of Nazism and fascism. This is what I would call the Popperian imperative. So let me just pause for a second here and drive this point home. If politicians are making policy, making up numbers, and saying things that are clearly not true, it's up to us as scholars to probe and to test and to push back on this. So that is what I call the Popperian imperative. And Popper said if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. And he quickly added, I don't imply that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies. This is the key point. As long as we can counter them and keep them in check, counter them by rational argument, keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be most unwise. So the reason I bring this out so strongly is because the immigration debate has morphed into a debate against science. It is an anti-enlightenment debate, an anti-enlightenment philosophy pushing against this critical rationalism. So politicians and policymakers increasingly just make things up, and they are pushing policies that are not founded in facts. To say that immigrants take jobs away from natives when there is a very large body of economic literature that can demonstrate that that's not true, then it's incumbent upon us as scholars to say, but that, wait a minute, that is simply not true. To say that Haitian refugees in a little town in Ohio are eating the cats and dogs, you know, that is patently not true. You can see that it's not true. So we have to think about this Popperian imperative. And of course, we know that liberalism, both in its classical and contemporary forms, is built upon this paradox. So how can we resolve this paradox? Well, let me just, I'm almost finished. So if you want to ask me, how do societies confront the liberal paradox? How can they be both open and closed at the same time? I will say the key to managing migration, the key are rights. You have to give rights to people who come and live in your society and work there. If you do not do that, then you end up in the situation of the United States with 10 or 12 million people who are living outside of the social contract, who are living there without membership and without status. And of course, that's bad for the migrants. It's bad for the society that hosts migrants without these rights, without status. So if you're going to attack immigration or immigrants, I've often really worried about this throughout my career, having brought so much attention to the liberal paradox, then you take away the rights. You take away the rights of the migrants and the asylum seekers. And that is exactly what the Trump administration is doing. So I think I probably should conclude here. I just a few more slides if you'll, and then I'm very curious to hear how Sandra reacts to all this. Has Trump resolved the liberal paradox? I would say no. I would say no. And I could give an entire lecture about what's happened to the post-war liberal consensus, the rise of reactionary populism, the anti-immigration politics that we see across the Western world. That's a different paper. It's a different talk. But certainly Trump has, as Johnny D'Amato pointed earlier today in his opening remarks, Trump has undermined this liberal consensus, open to trade, open to investment, open to migration. All of these things go together. Trump has rolled back the rights of immigrants and minorities. So he is trying basically to resolve the paradox by getting rid of liberalism. I never thought that, I would say that, but, one way to resolve the liberal paradox is to get rid of liberalism and to get rid of liberal democracy. He has restricted the right to asylum, again, undermining international law. But, and here's my caveat, Trump, I don't think he can repeal the laws of supply and demand. So the economic dilemmas that I have talked about are still very much with us, and the demographic dilemmas as well. The demand for foreign labor, both skilled and unskilled, remains very high. And the U.S. has undergone a demographic transition, now has an aging society. However, I would just, a couple of words of conclusion. Johnny was saying earlier, or last night to me over dinner, we have to keep perspective on this, which means understand that the U.S. is still a pluralistic society. It is still a pluralist democracy. Yes, the U.S. institutions have broken down, I would say. There are no institutional checks for the moment on Trump, but we have multiple centers of power in the U.S., and I still think we will get through this and that U.S. liberal democracy will survive. Certainly, the liberal paradox is still with us. It is still very much there. And in Japan, they're debating this. The ideas, I know, this idea was very popular at one point in Germany. The Germans very acutely aware of the liberal paradox. So have we reached the end of the liberal interregnum? Maybe I'll ask that question to Sandra. Have we reached the end of this post-war liberal order? I think we can say clearly we are at a hinge of history here. It may be premature to simply pronounce the death of the liberal order, 1945, 1925, rest in peace. Certainly the British and the French have not gone down this path, at least not yet, nor have the Japanese. So the great game of immigration politics is going to continue. I could talk more about that. I've got many international lectures I could give, but I will conclude with this simple note here that open societies, our liberal and democratic societies, they depend upon good migration governance. And whether we're going to be in a vicious or a virtuous cycle, will very much depend on how our governments manage migration going forward. And I congratulate all of you. I congratulate Johnny and others for having such a fantastic research program here to look at all of these questions. And I think it's incumbent on all of us in this room to think about how our work is informing the public debates, and we must be able to engage, to stand up and follow the Popperian imperative, advance falsifiable arguments using critical rationalism to push back against the illiberal and anti-Enlightenment views that have become so prevalent at this point in history. So thank you very much. My turn to listen.
Thank you. I think I should move a bit here, right, for the camera. Well, this is not an easy task after such a comprehensive and complex and multifaceted talk. But I will start with the easy part to thank you, Jim, for all your contributions, your significant contributions tonight here to this audience. In the 12 years of the NCCR, where you were on our advisory board and you inspired the research within the NCCR to a great extent, and you were often there at the annual retreats, and it was always a privilege for us to have you among us and to follow your advices and your guidance in research. And of course, thank you for the field of migration studies, because as Karin was saying in the beginning, your conceptual contributions are just fundamental pillars around which much of the migration research has developed. So in particular, the notion of the liberal paradox and your four trade-offs that within which states have to navigate for migration policy. And it helps us so much to understand why these things are complicated and why they are never perfect, and why there will always be critique, there will always be politicization, because there are these just fundamental structural tensions. And so your talk was incredibly rich as a compte rendu of the American immigration policy history, but more broadly on these fundamental challenges. And I cannot do justice to it, and so I will focus on basically one point and then open up for the discussion. My point goes back to the liberal paradox and its articulation as demand on the one hand, and demand for openness on the one hand, and demand for closure on the other hand. And I think these different demands, the first point I would like to make to this is that they may be actually embedded in the liberal world order itself, because we have a state system which is particularistic and demands foreclosure. Not only politics demand foreclosure, it's a state itself that demands foreclosure. And then we have a liberal, I don't want to say ideology, but liberal aspirations that are universal. And we have the rights, the legal system in liberal democracies has been framed in liberal terms. We can imagine legal systems that are not liberal, right? I don't think the rule of law has to be liberal, but this was a major achievement of the post-World War II order in the West and the liberal democracies, that we have a legal system that is liberal, and this liberal legal system has as such an expansive dynamic. So when we have the liberal paradox, it's not only the demand for workers, it's not only the economy that demands openness, it is also our fundamental laws, constitutions and courts. And of course you develop this notion of rights very forcefully as well. But I think maybe it is important to bring this up after you talk again, because you are certainly right that Trump will not nullify the structural economic demand of aging societies and of capitalism for flexible labor and so on. But what about the capacity of such politicians to invalidate the rights dimension? Yeah, I think the demand will stay, but what about the rights? And here it's a much more long-lasting trend that we can observe. Trump is just the caricature of it, but it has started basically in parallel with the legalization, with the codification of migrant rights. We have had practically immediately a counter-reaction of practices, but also policies that circumvent its rights and that restrict them. And in the literature, we have now more of such studies that come up that show, yes, we have had we have the liberal paradox, and we have had this liberal convergence towards more expansion of rights, Soysal, Brubaker, this literature. But we also have something like the market model. Jest and Boucher have developed this notion, market model of migration, not the liberal model, but really the market model that is based on the guest workers that you showed, the braceros, and they did not go away. Maybe we were too optimistic. We thought, yes, we have had the diffusion of the rights and the courts being empowered, but these practices have not gone away. You have the irregular workers, and we have always had some temporary types of work that is tied to the employer, that is not free to change, that has a sponsor. And now we have the posted workers in Europe that, are just sent by an employer to do some cheaper work in another country and hardly enter the legal system of that country. And at the international level, we have it also in the trade in services that also has this notion of posted workers. So it's a continuity. And in the field of asylum as well, we can see as soon as states have introduced national asylum systems and signed the Geneva Convention, they have introduced notions of safe third countries, visa policies, and other filters to reduce their intake of asylum seekers and refugees. So perhaps it's a dialectical relationship that we have there. And while populists may not be able to fight against the economic demand as long as we are in a liberal capitalist system, but liberal in the sense of capitalism, maybe we are observing something at the level of the rights that is more sustained and more really at the edge of a transformation. Yes, and perhaps with this, I would open up for the discussion.
Jim, I suggest that we take a few questions from the audience, and then you can answer.
Yes, thank you, Jim, and also thank you, Sandra, for both your talks and the exchange of your ideas. I was thinking during listening both of you, and I think also Sandra's last sentences were very important, to which extent we have to take democracy in the formula, because populists basically think of an imagined majority which they want to mobilize in order to break the right system, but also the whole liberal idea of the rule of law. So the question is obviously our societies, because the state, I see the state as a synonym for societies which we are. I mean, if there are impulses which you explained historically too, which are going against the presence of others who are moving, I mean, what are there the means? I mean, we cannot preach, because you cannot preach it with a scientific argumentation, alone at least. I mean, you can show where the errors are, but you cannot convince people who don't really are interested in science, as we saw also during the pandemic, that another argumentation is right, because for them, this is all fake.
Well, okay, I think this is still on. I'll just quickly, I don't know if we want to take several questions or should we respond? Why don't we take a few questions? Johnny, I'll come back to your question.
Hi, I have a question about the military complex, the military complexes in which we are at the moment, and where you situate that in liberal theory, whether you would say it's more in the market dimensions or cultural dimension or demographic,
Mm-hmm.
and how can we think together with those dynamics?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, keep taking more questions here. I'm trying to take some notes so I can remember the questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really, really interesting to see. And I had a question about this comment that Trump can't change the supply and the demand of labor and how that relates to immigration. But my fear is that with the influence of specifically tech leaders, that there's a belief, I don't know if it's a very well-founded belief, but that technology can do a significant amount in changing that labor. So I don't know if you've thought about that dynamic and that belief and how that works into the moment we're in, but I'd be interested to hear, if you have a comment on that.
Maybe we should try to answer these three questions and we take three more questions. But no, Johnny, I think raises the difficult, thorny question. You know, how do you engage with so many people in our societies who have lost all confidence in numbers, facts, and unfortunately, I don't have an easy answer for that question. But I do think, again, looking around this room, it comes back to the fundamentals of education. You know, to some extent, this is, I think, a failure of our educational system. But it also goes back, I would try to respond to Johnny by saying, go back to the narratives. I don't know, is there a narrative in Switzerland about immigration? There must be some Swiss idea, you're Swiss, some Swiss myth. How do you engage with those narratives? You know, how do you change the narrative? Because I think that's a huge challenge. And that comes back to politicians, parties, political leaders, and the ability to some politicians to respond to those who are taking a purely demagogic approach to get votes. So that would be my attempt to respond to Johnny on the military. Let me see, you asked this question about the military and security. This is not a very good answer, but I mentioned that I was in Japan for a couple of weeks. And if you think of security and the military, does immigration play a role at all in this? Does it figure into thinking about security and defense? I'm just challenging you to try to put your thinking cap on. Did you know in Japan they don't have soldiers. They need people to serve in the army. And they're thinking, well, if we're going to have soldiers, we may have to have immigrants, foreigners who come in to serve in the military. I haven't looked at the numbers. Look and see how many of the American military, how many of the soldiers are immigrants. There are many of them. And one of the ways to get citizenship in the United States, they're mercenaries. I mean, go back to the narratives. I mean, you look at the stories in the paper about this soldier or that soldier who served bravely, brilliantly in wars, but is now in danger of being deported, having their children deported. I saw a story just today about an American soldier with a son who was maybe some Jamaican origin. They're deporting the soldier, deporting the son. So I don't know if that's a good response to your question, but it is a good question. Yeah, you want to respond? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood your question. Yeah. Well, again, I'm going to give you a very unsatisfactory answer to this question, but I think Johnny or Sandra alluded to the fact that we live in a world of nation states. And we cannot, I don't think a scholar simply wish away that world. The nation state is based on territory, it's based on population, control of the population, control of the territory. So and this, I'll hand you the microphone in just 1 second. If the state is seen to lose control, the perception of people is the state is losing control of the border of the territory. You know, that is politically very difficult. And certainly one of the reasons Donald Trump succeeded in getting reelected was because of the perception that President Biden had lost control of the border and the territory.
Yeah, I would like to add to this that I find the question very interesting, intriguing from the perspective of what we understand by liberalism and the liberal paradox. And I guess we really have to become more differentiated with this notion of liberalism, because this industry that has been developing and financed and creates a demand for more security and offers a supply and so on. It's big business. It's very liberal in this sense, right? But yeah, it is really atroce from the perspective of human rights and accountability and all these principles. So I mean, there are some parallels with big tech, with you know, these market players that are taking over, and somehow this migration field is also a magnifying glass where you can see tendencies that are wider, yeah, and perhaps express themselves first towards the most weak parts of society, right? The migrants in this case. And maybe for democracy is the same point, post-factual world, populists and so on, social media, the easiness of diffusing wrong information, also artificial intelligence. I mean, if we are positive, we can think that people will, as humans, will get fed up from all this artificial stuff and will look more for personal contacts and maybe also the jobs. I mean, many things will be done automatically, as the other, you asked this question, right? Automation and so on. Yeah, I guess this will happen. So what will people do? Perhaps they will really look for human contact, and then maybe things can become better, because they will notice that if you know someone who is from somewhere else, this is not so different after all.
Yeah, just quickly on that last question about tech. I mean, there's an old debate in the migration field, and it boils down, you know, can capital substitute for labor, basically? So can technology essentially substitute for labor? It's a very old debate, and it's an interesting debate. Can we have machines that pick all of the strawberries and the blueberries? And yes, there are machines that can do this. They're not perfectly efficient. Do we have machines that can take care of very old, very elderly and sick people, and changing the beds and the diapers and bedpans? The Japanese are working on creating robots, you know, to do this. But I go back to, I think Sandra is right. I mean, just imagine if when you're old and sick and your parents or your grandparents, you want robots taking care of your parents. I would just finally add about this tech issue. If any of you in the room ever heard of a guy named Elon Musk? Does that name ring a bell? He got very upset with Trump and his advisors because they want to cut off access to the highly skilled people, the engineers, the scientists. Musk himself, of course, South African, who came through the window that I was talking about, the H-1Bs, and he said, no, but wait a minute. My companies depend on those highly skilled foreign labor. You can't restrict that. You shouldn't cut that off. So he got into, obviously, an argument about this with Trump and his advisors. So, and don't forget to go back to the military-industrial complex. Musk, of course, is reaping great benefits from the work he's doing for the military with satellites and other technology. So, so you can see how migration plays directly into these debates. More questions?
Yes, thank you very much. So my question would be in relation to the large numbers of undocumented workers, as you mentioned. And your conclusion, Professor Hollifield, was the system is broken. My question is the system broken, or is it functioning as some intend it to function? And surely there are a large number of particular interest groups that want there to be a population of people who are not rightless because they cannot be alienated from their rights, but who cannot access their rights. And I would also be interested from Sandra in the European perspective on that, because our conclusion of the situation in Europe is that this is the deliberate choice of policymakers, because the obvious policy consequences in asylum and migration policy is the creation of ever-increasing numbers of people who are exploitable in this situation. So EU asylum reform, the direction of Ukraine policy, at the same time recruiting more and more people who are in precarious situation is going to lead to that tendency. On the other hand, maybe that's too much of a conspiracy. I mean, policy outcomes are often more a question of dysfunction rather than deliberate choice.
Let's take a couple more questions. I don't know how much time we have left, but try to get in as many questions as we can. Yeah. Okay. Robin has got the microphone.
No, thank you. I was literally just going to ask the same question and saying, like, yes, Trump didn't resolve the liberal paradox, but maybe he didn't want to resolve it and play with it. Yeah. And he wants to make, he doesn't necessarily want to deport all undocumented migrants, but he wants to make them vulnerable, exploitable, and disposable. So is it the end game?
Yep.
And the rest of my question is basically the same.
Yep. Great questions. Yeah. Take another question here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the great presentation. But also, when I was seeing everything, I was thinking these are much more the perspective of the destination countries, the perspective of destination countries. But I would like to also think about maybe the source countries of these migrations, because also what I was thinking, these Western countries had built their wealth based on colonialism to some extent, but also migration. But now they are also exploiting these resources, human resources of other countries. What will be the future look like?
Great question. Okay, well, I think we have 3 or at least 2.5 good questions. Maybe take one more question in the back here before we come back.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Peter Arabo. I want to ask about the Safe Third World Country Agreement between the US and Canada. How are they be able to resolve it now that we have new president in US and the new leader in Canada? How are they be able to resolve the issue of Safe Third World Country Agreement?
Okay, there was a little bit, I had trouble understanding the last part of the question, but I know it was about US and Canada, and perhaps the migration dimension of these debates. But let me see if I can quickly, your question is, I guess I would say, the old chestnut in migration scholarship, and I don't want to give an entire lecture about this, but it goes back to arguments that can be certainly traced back to Marx, maybe even beyond, that capitalism needs an industrial reserve army to function. You've got to have a large exploitable labor force. And I actually wrote part of my dissertation about this question. And I came to the conclusion that in liberal societies and liberal democracies, it doesn't really work that way, because migrants are very rational, very capable people, and they often find ways of getting membership and citizenship. They do acquire rights. And when you look at the U.S. immigration system, one of my economic colleagues once described it as an adjustment of status system. If you can get yourself a good lawyer and work the system and the bureaucracy, you can find a way of achieving adjustment of status. It's slow, it's arduous, and of course, in the meantime, you're being perhaps exploited, your family are vulnerable. But it's a system that, has functioned at some level. But of course, the demand for labor is just far outstrips the supply. So the result is a very large black market for labor. And what I was trying to stress at the end of my talk is that is what ultimately undermines the support for immigration, that and the loss of control of borders. So to the extent that politicians want to restrict the rights of immigrants, and especially those who are unauthorized or undocumented, that further undermines the social contract, eats away at the foundations of the liberal state. Now, obviously, I'm assuming we all are liberals. We'd like to see a more liberal, more open society. I would just conclude by saying, if you go back before Rupert Murdoch acquired the Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal was pretty consistent as a capitalist newspaper that we should have open borders. We should let the markets, decide how many migrants should come in. I think we can all agree that's probably politically unrealistic, but certainly the Wall Street Journal editorialized for more open borders. The gentleman who asked the question here, it sounded like a similar question, so I think I've responded to that. I didn't quite catch the question about U.S. and Canada, but I would just say that if you, and I would refer you to some of my other work on what I call migration interdependence, and also to go back to the question about the sending societies. I think this is still, for all of you scholars in the room here, especially the younger scholars, I think the biggest issue in our field is going to be how migration affects economic and human development, how it is affecting the sending societies, the global South, and don't forget, I didn't put this chart up there, but the mobility of people is growing much faster in the South than it is in the North. Up until the Ukraine crisis, 85% of the people of concern to UNHCR within the global South. So migration, I would say, is the biggest development issue in the world today. And migration, if it is managed appropriately, can lead to, as I said, a more virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle. Yes, I know the old arguments about the brain drain, but if we allow people to move more freely, more mobility across borders, migration, the brain drain can become a brain gain, as we see with return migration. Look at what's happening now between the U.S. and Mexico, for example. I think the same will happen U.S. and Central America, that we'll see more of a virtuous cycle as people are able to circulate more freely, You will see more brain circulation. Again, I could go on and on about this, but I do think that's the big issue. That's the big question. Trump, we will eventually get through this. I think hopefully we limit the damage that he does. But the bigger issue of migration and human development, I think we have to focus on the human development dimension of this, is really a very, very large issue. U.S. and Canada, everything the U.S. does affects Canada. I think it was Prime Minister Elliott Trudeau who said living next to the United States is like sleeping with an elephant, he said. Every time it twitches, you're afraid you are going to be. And of course, the famous quote from the Mexican president, Porfirio Diaz, in the 19th century, so close to the United States, so far from God. Do you remember that quote? The North American region is a single economic area, and Trump is trying to reverse all of that. I don't think he will succeed. The idea of cutting Mexico off from Texas or the United States it's far, far too late for that, in my view.
Yes, I would love to answer to Catherine Woolard. It's such a pleasure to see you here. We were studying together in Florence for our PhDs 30 years ago. Are you coming in October? We will celebrate. Yeah, should not say that. All right. No, but yeah, you addressed this issue of precarity being promoted and the rights diffusion rolled back. And I agree with this observation, and I would like to highlight some thoughts about the dynamics behind that, because I think there has really been a sort of a cat and mouse game between the legal system that has expanded rights and the states that have tried to re-get control over this. And so you said migrants, if they find a good lawyer, they will get it their way. And this happened. I mean, we had this strategic litigation, especially also in the field of asylum, where we have had court judgments, especially then at supranational courts, the European Court of Human Rights, that has continuously put new constraints on state action. So the norm of non-refoulement has been found to apply also extraterritorially with the Hearsay judgment. We have had the litigants to resort to tort law, to criminal law, to right of the child, to law of the seas, to try to fill the gaps that states were using when moving out of the jurisdiction where they could be held back for human rights abuses and asylum law abuses. And states have learned of this. At every step, they have learned to find new leeways. And there's now a literature coming up also in legal anthropology that examines these dynamics. And a lady called Greenberg, I don't remember her first name, speaks of counter-pedagogy, right? States learn from the courts how to circumvent again, and also the notion of reverse litigation is coming out, that states and conservative actors, anti-immigration parties are now entering the game, also seizing the courts. And the last judgment of the European Court of Human Rights regarding Libya, that is now no longer cooperating with Italy directly in pushing back migrants in the Mediterranean, but is being paid, is being basically directed by Italy and the European Union in doing this. Some authors have coined this strategy breaking the legal link, Slominski and Müller. They say, well, the Europeans don't do it themselves physically anymore. They do it indirectly by getting the Libyan militias, I would like to say, to do it. And the case was taken to the European Court of Human Rights as well by litigants arguing for a functionalist notion of legal responsibility. And what has been the result? Just of 12th of June, I think, the court said, inadmissible. We have no jurisprudence. Libya is not a member state of the European Convention of Human Rights, and they acknowledge everything. They acknowledge the abuse, atrocious abuse of human rights in Libya, in the detention centers. They cite the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. They cite even the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights. And all these reports that have been made, they acknowledge everything. But it's like a checkmate, right? In chess, they can't, they find they can't. But this is, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but we know that the court is under attack. There have been several petitions by member states saying, please be less innovative and expansive, or we will leave the system. And so the legal system is reacting. We have a change in these dynamics.
I just reminded a quote from an old right-wing French politician who said, "Nous n'avons pas le gouvernement des juges dans ce pays." So, you know, there's a reason why Trump is attacking the courts, because clearly the courts are a big constraint on executive action. And there's a reason why Trump doesn't like Europe. Europe, the European community, the European Union, I think it's the greatest accomplishment, really, in some ways, in the post-World War II era. I mean, think of what's happened in Europe. It's become a great liberal bastion, a liberal area, the four freedoms. So, unfortunately, there's a reason why Trump and his vice president don't like Europe. And I count Switzerland as part of Europe, by the way. Other questions?
Thank you. I think we will stop here, and because now we can continue the discussion on the liberal paradox, but also other topics at the interlope at the reception dinner. But before that, I would like to thank you once again, Jim, for this thoughtful lecture, very engaging lecture. Thank you also to Sandra for the discussion, and thanks also to Karine for the organization of this this event. And thanks to you, of course, to all of you present and for your engaging questions. Now let's go for a lunch.